Welcome, everybody. You guys are troopers. I know it is beautiful out, and it has been a long but really, really interesting day. So thank you all for staying with us, and welcome to this discussion on policy and advocacy. And I've taken the liberty of adding politics to the end, so hopefully that is okay. And it's really great. Thank you, Stephen, Robin, and Amos for that great discussion. I think it's actually really appropriate to be having this discussion immediately following one on social entrepreneurship, a field in which I've spent a lot of my career, because I think it's it begs the question, what are the best ways to make social change? Is it through social entrepreneurship? Is it through service? Is it through policy, advocacy, politics? Is it running for office and holding office? Or is it trying to advocate for issues you care about from the outside? And this is a question that I struggle with, and I think we're going to try and touch on during this conversation. I used to think I wanted to run for office when I was a kid, and now I'm like, is that the best way to go? Are there other ways to make change? Is that for me? So I think we want to just have a really robust conversation about how do you make social change? Can you make it through policy, advocacy, and government anymore? And if so, what's the best way to do that? And what's the most effective way to do that? And I just want to say, first of all, how psyched I am to be here celebrating the 10th anniversary of Tisch. Actually, John Tisch gets a lot of credit for naming the school, which probably is appropriate. But I actually think when I was a student here, I was on the advisory committee around the formation of what was then the University College of Citizenship and Public Service, or the UCCPS, and I would go around talking about the program, and I would always call it the Ookipus, until the PR committee asked me to stop, and then a few years later, he changed the name to Tisch. So I think I take a little bit of credit, but seriously, I just want to say thank you to Nancy, to Rob, to Deb, to Alan Solomon, who we saw yesterday. You all have changed my life and set me on the course that I am currently on in many, many ways, including the fact that when I graduated, I was a Dutco Fellow, which was the fellowship that Deb Jossman started, and many of us here in the room, which allowed me to get my first job in politics at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, where I spent the first half of the cycle recruiting candidates and targeted House districts, and the second half running the issue advocacy department. And then I moved back to Boston to work for the Democratic Convention, but my job wasn't starting for a few months, so I went and interned or consulted with the Tisch College on their alumni engagement program, where I got to know Vanessa Kirsch, who was on the board. Vanessa, some of you may know, was married to a man named Alan Casey, who was at the time running City Year, and this was in 2003 when Congress had cut funding for AmeriCorps. The first, or one of the many times they've cut funding for AmeriCorps, and Alan was running this campaign, and Vanessa said, you got to go help Alan just for a month, and so I went over and stayed for a year. Went to law school, and as I was graduating, Alan had just left City Year and was starting to be the change, and he said, you got to come help me just for a month to get this thing started, and here I am, 4 years later. But it was all really through tough, so I'm really grateful and honored to be here. So let's get started. I just want to tell a quick story, and then we're going to hand it over to the panel. I was flying here on Virgin America, which has these really cool TV screens at every seat, and you can chat with people in other seats. And I was watching an interview with Warren Buffett, who presented the following scenario. And actually, in fairness, I think he probably borrowed this from John Rawls, but nevertheless, it was an interesting scenario. He said, imagine it was 24 hours before you were born, and a genie appeared. And the genie said, what I'm going to do is let you set the rules of the society into which you will be born. You can set the economic rules, the social rules, and whatever rules you set will apply during your lifetime and your children's lifetime. And as a Tufts alum, you'll say, well, that's nice, but what's the catch? The catch, the genie says, is that you don't know whether you'll be born white or black, rich or poor, able-bodied or infirmed, intelligent or not. And it occurred to me, and then he said, what rules do you want to have? And it occurred to me that we are all born into a society that has rules or laws. And no matter how hard any of us have worked to get here, and many of us have worked very hard to get here, we were not able to choose the family into which we were born, the color of our skin, our sexual orientation. And what this panel is all about, and what today has been all about, is how do we change the rules and the laws to make sure that they are fair and equitable, or how do we at least make sure that people are taken care of within the current framework of rules and laws that exist. And I think the folks on this panel today represent different ways of either making or changing those laws, or advocating that they be changed in some way, or making sure that people are advocating to make sure that people are taken care of in some way. So I was going to do a slightly longer introduction of our four panelists, but I think Nancy probably covered it, and we don't want to waste time because we only have an hour. And I really want to make sure there's time for questions. And we don't need to do this super formal. If somebody says something that sparks something in your mind, feel free to raise your hand during the conversation, but we're definitely going to leave 15 minutes or so anyway at the end for questions. So I want to start a little bit backwards, and I actually want to start with Mitch. You have worked, you have worked for a member of Congress. I think Nancy mentioned you worked for Congressman Markey. So you've worked for a decision maker. You've worked for a lawmaker. So I have a two-part question. One is, having worked in government, having worked on the Hill, is government still an effective way to make change? Is my first question. And my second question is, can you talk to us about an issue you worked on or a decision that was made, and tell us about what makes an advocate for that issue successful? So many of us in the room are working on issues that we care about, and we're working with legislators. What are the tricks? What is it that you and your boss are looking for? How do we make the most effective argument possible as advocates that would be useful to you?
Okay. I think the first part of that is maybe a little bit of background. I spent 3 years working for Congressman Markey. I actually started on the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming, and then I went to his personal office and did a slew of policy areas for him, including appropriations, fiscal, judiciary issues. So to your first question, yes, I do think government's still effective. That's why I went to go work in government right after I graduated. And to the second point, I think that there's really 3 qualities, at least when advocates would come in, that we saw that were really effective. I think the first one was there has to be a human element to whatever story you're telling. So if you're an advocate for any policy, it is very, very important that you humanize the subject, because oftentimes when you're meeting with the congressman, and even if you're meeting with a staffer, they tend to understand best from you saying, this is my reality, and this is what I would like to see. I think the second part of that is you have to build a coalition. The fact of the matter is that every elected official has to think about, will I get reelected? Can I keep my job? And so you want to have a strong coalition. And I think the third part of this is you have to have a greater perspective beyond just what you're advocating for. And what I mean by that is sort of you have to have a sense of 5 years down the line, how will that policy play out for the long term? And so those are the sort of the things, the 3 things that I think you really need to be mindful of, whatever you're pushing. And I know that the effective policy areas, and I'll give you one example of this. When Congressman Markey had a bill that was dealing with climate change and energy, and that bill passed the House. Now that bill had a number of different issues in it. A few of those issues dealt with smart transportation, including the green line that's now going to go behind, I think here on Boston Ave, right? Yeah. And a number of people said, we want more funding for that issue. But what was really effective is that they came in with the same outfits that they would wear when they bike to work every day, and they came with a coalition of other organizations that really thought that this was an effective expenditure of money. And so when they came in, it's nearly 20 people, and the congressman, and I think Congressman Markey, who I worked for, is one of the best, was blown back. Wow, so this many people from Arlington and the surrounding areas really care about this issue. The next day, he called in the chief of staff and said, look, we need to get this done. People in my district want this, and it was in the bill, additional funding. That's not always the way it works, and it's oftentimes not that easy, but I think that there's something to showing that you have a coalition, showing that there's a human element to this and that you really care about it, and also sort of understanding, giving understanding to that elected official that there's more to it in the long run.
Yeah, and just to get real tactical for a second, because I'm curious, we are, the organization I work for often asks people to make phone calls, send emails to your member of Congress. And Carl, you could touch on this too. How effective is that? Emails, phone calls, letter writing, A. And then B, how many? Like, what if we can get 10 people to call, is that better than getting 100 people to send in a form letter?
The great thing about being a law school student is that I'm no longer a government official, to be honest. I think that emails are oftentimes the most ineffective way to get a message out. Yeah, ineffective. I just think that anything that you're trying to put forth, a call, to be honest with you, is much better. if you are measured in your call, if you're not screaming on the other end of the phone, it works much better. And honestly, an in-person meeting, and the one rule that most offices that are effective should have, I think, is you have to, as a staffer, sit down and meet with everyone. That was our rule. So if you have a chance to come in and just sit down with the staffer, you should do it. I think emails are just, I can't give you one example of where an email transformed anything I was working on or really helped me think about something differently.
Yeah, all right, that's good to know. Yikes. All right. Excellent. Carl, along the same lines, can you tell us a little bit about, obviously you are the only legislator, elected official on the panel, which is great, and thank you for joining us. Would love to just hear from you, again, a two-part question. One is, why did you decide to make that leap from advocate and active citizen to elected official? And are you glad you did? That's part one and 1A. And then the second question is, how can elections and campaigns be used to move policy forward? So we see once you're elected, you know, and you're in office, sort of obviously we've seen what happens on the floor, but how do you use and how can we use actual elections and campaigns to push issues that we care about?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. This is a great panel. I'm impressed so many of you are here when it's 65 degrees and sunny outside. So you guys are the true stalwarts. And if you didn't know it was that warm out, just ignore that I just said that.
Yeah, what?
But actually, just a brief follow-up on the conversation about emails and the effectiveness of them, just to give a slightly different perspective, because it might be different for a U.S. congressional office than it is for a local office or a state legislative office. In my office, we don't get a lot of people that make the trek even down to Boston to go to the State House, but we do get a lot of people that email. And a lot of people will ask, is that an effective way of communicating? And the answer, from my honest opinion, is if that is all you can do as an advocate, do it. If you can take the next step and make the phone call, take the next step. If you have the time to make the meeting appointment, take the meeting appointment. But if all you have time to do in your busy life is send an email, send it. It's better than doing nothing. I really mean that. And we get emails from people. When we get a barrage of a form email of 50 emails of the exact same issue, I know I have to respond to 50 people and say, yes or no, I agree with you or I disagree. That's an effective thing for me to have to be accountable to them. And even if it's one email, honestly, if I get an email from one constituent about one issue that I've never heard of or a bill that I've never read or learned about, it forces me as a legislator to actually look at the issue and look at the bill and actually learn something about it and give you as a constituent an answer. So it's still, while it's not the most effective, it's still valuable to do. And I would say if it's all you have time to do, don't ignore it because you don't think it's effective enough. Still do it. That's just to throw that out there.
I completely agree.
Yeah. But that being said, we get a lot of email, and we all do in the world, and so it's not always the most effective thing when it gets swamped out. But in terms of elections, you know, I studied biology at Tufts. I took one political science course my entire time here. I was a bio junkie. I loved working in the greenhouse up on the top of Barnum. But I was also very involved in student activism, and especially with the GLBT community at the time. And when I graduated, I found that the ability to get active in any issue is harder off campus than it is on campus. The environment here fosters active citizenship. It encourages active citizenship. It encourages debate of issues. The gay marriage debate, which was exploding in 2002, 2003, was really what got me to very closely focus on my state legislator who represented this district before me for 14 years. And when I went to his office hours, I took that next step and went to his office hours because I never got a response to his email. But I went to his office hours and advocated as a citizen, and having my state rep tell me he didn't support my right to equality and say, you people this and you people that, to my face was very inspiring to want to run for office. And it was literally walking out of that meeting, I was there with my friend Rachel Berry, whose father, Jeff Berry, is a political science professor here. Rachel and I had gone to college here together. And Rachel turned to me and she said, you've volunteered on some campaigns before. You like that campaign stuff. You should run. I'll be your campaign manager. And that's literally where we started. And we managed to win that election by just 93 votes. But that election changed the course of the gay marriage debate in the Massachusetts legislature. Because every rep that was coming back into the new legislative session the next year who had to take another vote on gay marriage saw every incumbent that supported same-sex marriage got reelected, and one rep, in this case, that opposed gay marriage got defeated on that issue. And it sent a message politically that if you support equality, it's good for you politically. If you oppose equality, you might have consequences to pay at the ballot box. That is a sort of dramatic example of how you can use elections to change a policy outcome, but even in a more direct way when you're thinking about coalition building and thinking about how to build advocacy support for something you care about. A lot of us get involved in campaigns and go knock on doors or go make phone calls or hold signs for a candidate on election day. That's fantastic, and you can make a lot of change in that context, but the most effective way to make longer term change, I think, out of that campaign is figure out how you stay networked with those other people that are there with you as volunteers. In Somerville, the Reich supporters from 2002's election campaign cycle stuck together after that election campaign and said, we're a bunch of progressive Democrats, we have a similar set of values, we're all energized by this campaign, let's stick together and figure out what we can do locally. And we formed the Progressive Democrats of Somerville, which ended up changing a lot of the local context of campaigns in Somerville, as well as helping to elect state elected officials, myself included. So thinking about how you can network with the people that you meet and get involved with on campaigns and stay connected beyond that, I think is an effective way to think about how to build coalitions. We haven't seen it done very well, I think, by Governor Patrick's campaign or by the Obama campaign, but I think it's not their responsibility from the top, from the candidate, to organize people after the election. It's our opportunity as citizens to figure out how to use that energy to keep going forward afterwards.
That's great. So now I want to look at it from the other end. So those of us who are outside advocating for issues that we care about. And Chris, I'd love to talk to you. You spent your career really developing really great research, data, impact data, evidence. First of all, does that work? Is that helpful in advocating for issues that you care about? And also, I would love to hear from you, and I'm familiar with some of the things you've worked on, an example where perhaps you have advocated for an issue locally and then used that to try and affect the national conversation.
Sure. So I want to echo the thank you you've expressed for being here today. It's very nice, and I'm glad to share this because I don't often get the opportunity to talk about the knowledge that we generate as researchers and scientists and how that can have a larger impact beyond a peer-reviewed journal publication, which is ultimately what we're focused on a day-to-day basis. But I think the longer view and the broader perspective is to make real change, societal change. And so I've spent my time really working on studies to extend the knowledge base in the area of childhood nutrition. And looking for gaps in the literature and trying to have the foresight to understand where a piece of evidence will help change the discussion is really important. It doesn't always work out that way because doing experiments means you don't know the outcome. But if you're designing a hypothesis with a particular outcome in mind and you're creating it with the right theory base, you're likely to advance the conversation. And that's really how I live my professional career, trying to generate knowledge, evidence that will help push policy at the highest level. And I think the story I can tell is really a local national story. And it's in the context of childhood obesity and really social change. So about a decade ago, I did a large project with colleagues around the country to try to understand what key elements can help drive social change. And I probably wasn't the right person to do this work, and you'll understand when I tell you, but we decided to dig deeply into 4 social change models that we've realized in this country: tobacco control, breastfeeding, recycling, and seatbelt use. And just based on my age, I lived through those social changes. And so it was really interesting to think about my childhood versus where I was in my 30s, and realizing that there have been big shifts in this country. So we dug deep, we studied those models, and we tried to understand what the key elements were that led to their success so that we could apply them to obesity prevention. And I won't go through all of them, but they all had the same elements that led to their success, no surprise to all of you. And one of the big ones was a sound scientific base. None of them would have moved if there wasn't evidence and science to drive the move. So that's where I spend most of my time, is trying to create that evidence to drive it forward. But I think that when we're doing that type of work, and I guess I would call her my lifelong mentor and close colleague, Mim Nelson, is in the room, and she has spent her career doing this as well. think we try to construct our studies so we can eventually tell a story. And I think that was a really important point. So having a piece of evidence or some data in a table without the human side of it, without the story that you can bring to a politician or to someone who's giving funding away or to a parent in the community, it's really hard for people to understand what it really means. And so we embarked on a study called Shape Up Somerville almost a decade ago, using those lessons from other social change models. We were trying to generate the evidence, but also really look at creating a model that would be both top-down and bottom-up. So engaging the community, engaging every citizen in the community, and engaging the leadership in the community, and in particular, the political leadership. And we worked really at the local level to transform this one community and try to influence body weights of children in the community. And it was a pretty remarkable experiment that we did, and we were able to compare the change to children in other communities outside of Boston and get the paper published, which then really set an incredible series of events, including media attention and who would have guessed the current First Lady deciding she wanted to take on childhood obesity. So that resulted in a visit to the White House in a briefing. So it's a very short summary of the last decade, but it's a really important story because when I went to speak with her, I didn't just bring a table with p-values. I brought the story of a community coming together with a strong citizen base, political leadership, policy and environmental changes occurring in this community, and then I showed a biologic outcome. Mm-hmm. So it was quite different than what a lot of other scientists are often able to do with their experiments, but it's because we approach the science we do in a comprehensive way, and I think the key term is an interdisciplinary way. So I didn't do this alone. That probably goes without saying. I was one of many other investigators and citizens and professionals in the community who really dug in to this problem and helped generate those results.
That's great. And how was the White House? Cool. Yes?
How was the White House? I have to say the First Lady was very cool. Very impressive.
That's great. Thank you very much. And Rachel, among many different organizations you've worked for, you're now at a think tank. And so you're dealing with national and actually international issues. Would love to hear from you a little bit about what is the role of a think tank, first of all, and then if there is an issue that you're either currently working on or that you've worked on recently that you've developed at your think tank that you have managed to successfully advocate for on the Hill, and why did that work?
Sure, thanks, Greg. So I currently work for an organization called the Foreign Policy Initiative, which is sort of a quintessentially Washington, vaguely named organization that tells you actually nothing about our purpose. But we are very specific in our worldview and in our ideology, and I suppose most would use the term neoconservative to describe our ideas, although I have some issues with the way that some people interpret that term. To me, it means, and these are the values that our organization advocates for on a daily basis, a strong belief in American leadership, in American exceptionalism, in the importance of America's engagement with the world, the importance of America's military power, and a very strong commitment to the protection and advancement of democracy and human rights in the world. So we started our organization, which is kind of a non-traditional think tank in many ways. These are think tanks are uniquely Washington in their own way. My first job in Washington as a Ducko Fellow was at a much more established think tank that was 50 years old, and my parents had still never heard of it or didn't really know what a think tank was or how I might put my Tufts political philosophy degree to use until I told them about think tanks, which I think are especially in Washington, just a huge driver for the kind of active citizenship and the kind of engagement with the world of ideas that, in practical ways that we're talking about here today. So we started the Foreign Policy Initiative at the very beginning of the Obama administration. There was a group of conservative, right-of-center thought leaders, opinion leaders, advocates on TV who thought that in the absence of Republican leadership on Capitol Hill and a Republican White House, that there might be a vacuum of leadership on the right for foreign policy issues. And given that, decided to start a new organization that wouldn't have maybe the baggage of other think tanks, but be able to provide some leadership for the right on foreign policy issues. We launched in February of 2009 at a conference where Senator John McCain was our keynote speaker. It was his first major address on foreign policy issues since President Obama assumed the White House, and sort of notable in that way. We had a senior Democrat from the House Armed Services Committee, the senior Republican from the House Armed Services Committee, and a panel of experts talk about Afghanistan. And we launched on Afghanistan, and I'll use this as the particular issue that we've advocated for, because it was an instance where we actually, as a Republican group, as a right of center group, came out very strongly in support of the president's decision, which had been announced the previous week, to commit an additional 17,000 troops to the war in Afghanistan. And it was for me a lesson of, there's a lot of talk about the polarization of American politics and the polarization of the Congress, and it was a great example of, here we were, an organization that was founded to provide leadership for Republicans on foreign policy, and the first thing we did was an open letter to the president signed by a host of conservative leaders with very big names, saying, we as conservatives are going to support you in your commitment to this war effort. And this public conference was the way that we did that. That same month, the very first Tea Party rally was held in Washington, D.C., and I suppose another issue that we've spent a lot of time on since then, and an area where we continue to advocate, is a sort of a concern that we had at the time that particularly those on the right, during a time of financial crisis, during a time where there would be where there were two fairly unpopular wars, might use I guess two things. Might one, use it as an opportunity a political opportunity to take advantage of a moment to turn against the president on a matter of national security, to go against the war in Afghanistan at a time where he was recommitting to it. And also a broader concern that during a time of financial crisis at home, that the conservatives might say, why are we spending money overseas? We've got problems here at home. What are we doing playing around in the world? Let's just turn inward. And that trend toward isolationism would be something that, in our estimation, would be not only bad for American interests, but indeed bad for the world. And so we've spent a lot of time over the past 2 years that we've since we launched, advocating for continued spending, which as conservatives is a little bit awkward this time of year. Continued spending, and in fact increased spending on both the defense and the foreign aid budget. And it's something that I've really appreciated the experience over the last 2 years as a time to really realize kind of the strange bedfellow alliances that politics can breed, where we've actually, and our board of directors and myself and our executive director are all very committed Republicans who have done a lot of campaign work in the past, who have served in previous administrations for Republican members of Congress. We found ourselves often at odds with a majority of the House Republican caucus. And in fact, in line with the Democrat administration, we've been very supportive recently of the president's action in Libya. We were out very early encouraging the administration to enforce a no-fly zone, which they did, to intervene militarily, which they did. And so it's a time where I think as polarized as things are becoming, and I think as much as that may sometimes turn people off from politics as a way to create change, as a way to be an active citizen, there's at the same time a lot of hope for the kind of alliances that are tearing down barriers between parties and really bringing people together based on shared values of American leadership, in our case shared values of the value of democracy and human rights in the Middle East.
That's great. And just a really quick follow-up question. So to Mitch's point about sort of building coalitions, so you guys are coming up with these ideas which sound to be really powerful. How do you actually then go and advocate on their behalf without a sort of built-in grassroots structure or coalition? How are you actually making your point to members of Congress?
Right. So we're not a grassroots organization, and a lot of my background is in campaign politics and with grassroots organizations, and so So now really our resource and our leverage, and particularly in my role as Director of External Affairs, which involves all of our government relations efforts, is just in the value of smart people. And so my job basically is to get people who share our worldview and are thinking smartly and writing smartly about these issues before members of Congress and their staff. We obviously do a lot of larger staff briefings on national security issues. We've been doing a ton on the Middle East recently, on the defense budget, as the spending conversation continues. And then one-on-one meetings with members, of course. And there's not, the human element and the sort of district concerns are very important to members, and I'm a former congressional staffer as well, and I definitely understand that side of things. But there's I think particularly on foreign policy, there's a lot of members of Congress don't come in knowing a whole lot about foreign policy or really having, they don't run on foreign policy or national security issues, and especially a lot of people who came in the midterm elections were so focused that I don't know that they'd even really thought about foreign policy or America's role in the world. Mm-hmm. And we viewed that, some viewed that as a challenge. We viewed it as an opportunity to be the ones to get in front of them and say, hey, there are some serious things going on in the world. And they were, reminded of that in a very, very stark way with recent developments in the Middle East. And we've just, like I said, used it as an opportunity to get smart people in front of them saying, I've spent my career thinking about this. Mm-hmm. And
that's great. And I just want to point out that when I was a senior here at Tufts, I taught an explorations class on the 2000 presidential election, and Rachel was in the class, as was Bess. So if you thought her answer was super smart, I will take credit for all of that. Right. Which is great. Right. So I want to just talk for a minute, move away from sort of the meta, and just talk a little bit about identity politics, not because I think it's uber important, but because I think probably there are people in the room who can relate and may be interested in getting into politics. Carl, in your bio, it says you're one of the few members of the LGBT community serving in the legislature. What is that like? I mean, clearly that was sort of a piece of your campaign. Now that you're an elected official, what has that been like? Have there been challenges? Have there been benefits? And what advice would you give to other LGBT members of the community who may or may not be considering a run for office?
Well, the nature of my first campaign was actually a very freeing experience being an openly gay candidate, because my opponent decided to hype that issue so aggressively, and he sent a mailing in the fall with a very unflattering picture of me that said, "Do you want this radical, militant, extremist, anti-Catholic homosexual to be your state rep?" And when you still get elected after that kind of mailing, it frees you to actually be a radical, militant homosexual. Only partly joking there, actually. But in the legislature, it actually, both in the legislature and in the community, it's been, I think my challenge continues to be, how do I advocate both for my district, for my community, the parts of Medford and Somerville that I represent, for the families that live here, but also as one of the few gay members of the legislature, how do I be an advocate for the gay community across the Commonwealth? Because frankly, we all represent voices that are unique to ourselves and our own identities as well as our districts. So in a nutshell, how do I be the rep for Medford and Somerville and be the gay rep without the gay rep overshadowing the role that I have for my community? That's the challenge that I found. In a very simple way, to give you an example of what that means, when we were doing all the debates on gay marriage and there was constant press about the gay marriage issue and having my own local papers focus on my role in the gay marriage debate, it was very important to me to also make sure that I was proactively putting out stories about the other things I was also working on, the other issues that were also important to me, so that it didn't boil down to he is just the gay rep. And for some people that would be a good thing. Some people want the gay rep, but some people don't, and they want to hear that whether they agree or disagree on gay issues, that I can be a voice for their families and for their concerns as well, especially for those that don't care about LGBT issues. It's played out very interestingly for me in the last 3 years. I filed the bill to expand equal protections to the transgender community, which right now in Massachusetts, if you're a transgender, you can still be fired from your job, denied housing, kicked out of a restaurant, all without legal recourse. And so I have a bill to rectify that. And it's gained a lot of controversy, and it's again sort of put me in the spotlight of being the LGBT rep, the gay rep, working on gay issues. And it's been an additional pressure to make sure that as somebody that has personal friends that are transgender, to have people in the community that I've witnessed the discrimination and violence they face every day right here in Massachusetts as transgender people, it's important for me to stand up and fight for those issues, but still express to my community that yes, that's important, civil rights are important, and and I can also still be working for the issues impacting communities and families across the district who don't see themselves as having a stake in those issues. So that's the challenge I see in it, but it's something that I really love, and to be able to sit next to colleagues in the House who maybe hadn't met a gay person in their lives even 10 years ago, and it seems strange. Most of us feel like we know someone in our family or friend network that's gay, I think, in society now today, but that's not always the case. And for some of our more conservative members of the legislature, it was really important to me to reach out to them, to become a colleague, a friend, someone that they could see working with on whatever issues we were working on together in committee or wherever else. And then when the day came that a gay issue came up, they had some other context for having worked with me. We worked on the public health committee together, or in some other context worked together as colleagues, so that when the gay issue came up, they had a personal experience to look to. And I have no problem using the good Catholic guilt that I learned as a child growing up to share with my colleagues my concern as they cast votes on gay issues as well. So,
great. And Rachel, to go back to you for 1 second, and then Mitch, come to you. Slightly different, but you are a Republican active citizen who went to Tufts in Massachusetts. What is that like? And how does being a Republican active citizen? Any advice for Republicans who are here, even in the room or at Tufts, on sort of how to proceed?
Sure. Yeah, I can probably just meet with the one in the room afterwards. Right, yeah, I already know Anne. Yeah, people often ask me people in DC often ask me how I'm a Republican having gone to Tufts, and I generally just say that I really, really like elephants.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, I think being here, I think I was more of a Republican. I know I was more of a Republican when I left here than when I came to campus, and there's certain things that created that. One was the opportunity to get involved with campaigns in the area. I spent a lot of time in New Hampshire for some of the candidates up there, and also Mitt Romney ran for governor when I was a student here, and I was chairman of the College Republicans at the time, and very active with engaging the handful of us on campus with his campaign. It's been interesting, just even in the past 24 hours that I've been kind of back on campus here, there are lots of things that I miss about campus. One thing that I do not miss is hearing the somewhat disparaging remarks that sometimes come from our speakers and our podiums about folks on the right. I've heard, some anti-Tea Party rhetoric from the front of the room a couple of times, and it is, it's discouraging, but it's also challenging in another way, and it kind of challenges the way that you think about things. And I think there is maybe a perception that folks on the right and Republicans or I'm sorry, I guess the perception would be that there's something about active citizenship that is necessarily progressive or liberal, which I certainly don't think is true. I actually think there's a lot in the rhetoric and the foundation of the Republican Party that is very much in line with active citizenship, the belief that the government that is closest to the people governs best, for example. The strong belief in families and in faith communities and in the power of the individual. Those are all the reasons that I'm a Republican, and they're the reasons that I want to be an active citizen as well. And I think I was sort of joking at lunch with some friends that I was going to title my opening remarks, "The Tea Party is the picture of active citizenship." And I think there is, I think that there's a lot, there actually is a lot there. This what's happening in our country right now, and that is in large part, existing on the right now and embodied by the Tea Party. It's a citizen movement. I've been to Tea Party rallies around the country. I even spoke at a Tea Party once, and you can, attack me afterwards. These are active citizens. These are workers, their mothers, their teachers, their grandparents, their students who who are, you know, coming out and demanding better of their elected officials, and so I think particularly what I'm seeing in the country right now from where I sit is kind of Republicans and active citizenship going hand in hand, and that's something that I am actually really proud of about our party right now, and that our leaders are responding to that.
That's great. Thank you. We have 5 minutes before we're going to open it up for questions, so I just have one more question for Mitch and one for Chris. Mitch, so Rachel spoke about Governor Romney. You worked for Governor Patrick when he was candidate Patrick. When I think you told me he only had like 5% name recognition when you went to work for him.
Yeah,
Is that right?
I started before he even announced.
Before he announced.
He was running.
Yeah.
So it was exploratory days.
And so my question for you is why? And what about him drove you to go work for a candidate who most people had never heard of? And then also, what advice do you have for young people, undergrads who want to, or alums who want to get involved in politics as sort of a first step?
Sure, I'll be quick, because I know we won't have time for questions and the like. So a friend of mine who was approached by Governor Patrick to work on his campaign had said, hey, there's this guy, his name is Deval Patrick, he's thinking about running for governor. He said, have you heard anything about him? I said, no, I've never heard that name in my life. So then that night I actually went on to Google and did a Google search on him. He was an assistant attorney general for civil rights. And so I read his bio, really liked sort of what I saw initially, and wanted to get involved. And so I went into the office and said, I will do whatever you want me to do. And fast forward probably a year and a half later, I was helping to organize Boston and had organized colleges for his campaign. And I think for me, the reason why I just have always, I tend to lead with sort of my gut feeling. And when I met now Governor Patrick, I got a really good feeling for him as a person, and thought that he would be a really good leader. And I always felt like if we lose, at least I can lose with somebody that I actually believe in, and I know at the end of the day is someone who I know shares some values that I share. And so that's how I made that decision, even though it might not have been a smart decision that most people will make when somebody's at 5% name recognition. But we took the Tea Party approach, I guess, and just went door to door and demanded that people listen. So that was great. And then to the second part of your question in terms of how young people can get involved, I mean, I have always I find that oftentimes all it takes is saying, I am willing to work really hard and to learn as much as you will give me to learn. I think, and Carl, I'm sure you can, for very little money, but for a ton of experience, right? For a ton of experience, and hope that, and this is what I said when I first started working for the congressman, I just said, I am willing to do whatever you ask me to do. All I ask, and this is the only thing I ask, is that as I progress as a staffer, that you give me more responsibility. And that's always worked out, and I think that if you take the incentive and you sort of go to someone and you say, I really want to work on these issues, I'm really interested in this, do you mind giving me a chance? And you do really well. I think that most people succeed that way, and you also are nice and treat people well. That's so big. I mean, particularly in government, because you have to work with people in a very intimate setting, and you have to listen to a lot of people that you don't agree with, and you have to oftentimes smile and listen. So.
All right, well, you clearly have done all right. You're doing very well. And Chris, so my last question, I have 3 questions for you. We have 2 minutes, so I'm going to just ask them all sort of, and you can just pick the one you want to answer. One is I'm really curious, just going back to the first question, especially in the obesity, as we're dealing with the obesity epidemic, there's a lot of different strategies we can take, and some of them, there's service organizations that are doing really well. There are social entrepreneurial organizations that are really solving problems in the community. There's this policy piece and general public education. I'm just curious what you have found to be the most effective of those strategies is sort of part one. Part two is, a lot of the people that we are fighting against in this fight are large corporations who have a lot of money. and I don't know this for a fact, but I assume that the anti-obesity side does not have as much money. So I'm wondering, what is it like, and how do you make how do you make this argument without a lot of funding? And I guess I'll just stop there. My third one.
Okay.
We'll see if somebody else asks it. Yeah.
Right. So I wish that your first question had a simple answer, and I could cite one thing that I would say everyone should put their energy into, but it's not the case. You know, unlike the other social change models that I quickly ticked off, food is really difficult. We can't put it aside. We can't create one law to change it. It's around us all the time. You need it all day long. It's really complex. And so the issue of energy balance really does require many different disciplines and thought leaders to be involved. So to really move the needle, I don't think it's just coalition work or just laws and policies or just good science. I really do think it's a combination of them all, and that's really difficult. And if you look around the country, there are many efforts going on, but they're not well coordinated. And so at Tufts, we actually are working on a very large project right now that aims to coordinate different sectors at a very high level. So, and it's really the spirit of Tufts. So if we can succeed in this over the next 3 years, I think we can move the needle, but it won't be by taking one approach, it's multiple approaches. But just to, I think, reiterate what many people have said, including the last panel, pick what you're passionate about and stick with that and work with other people, and you will make a difference. The second part of it, you're absolutely right. There's a lot more money coming from industry to market products to children that are unhealthy, and billions and billions of dollars are spent sort of counter marketing what we try to do in public health. So it's very difficult. And the movement now is really public-private partnerships. And although there's still resistance within the academy, so to speak, from a lot of people, there's movement toward creative solutions where we can make it work, because it's the only way that we will make change. If we just continue to dig our heels in and say, industry has to change and listen to the scholars, it's probably not going to work. But there are great models out there where we can work together to make change. And the really important thing we have to do is create the right standards and guidelines to work within. So they have to be thoughtful. We have to learn from other experiences, failures and successes, and really put those together. And I think that's also what we're trying to do here at Tufts, because we pride ourselves on being solution-oriented, and that is the only way it will work. So I think you'll see a lot of change in the next 5 years with public-private partnerships in the food and nutrition world.
That's great. Thank you so much. All right. Would love to open up for questions, comments, feedback. Eric?
Thank you guys for speaking. I'm working with a group of other students here to create an institute at the Tisch College that really tries to develop leaders in public policy and politics on campus. And part of what I'd like to hear from you guys is your thoughts on how we can engage students who aren't typically very involved in politics, people who are engineering students or pre-med or whatnot, and try and get them involved in public policy, whether it's thinking that they'd run for office in the future or just sort of getting involved in issues and helping with campaigns or advocacy.
That's great. Thank you.
So I could start, because mine is going to be very different, I think.
Right.
From the science perspective, whether it's downtown or even up here, looking at the role models within the discipline who are advancing policies, serving on national committees, not just creating the evidence, but taking that evidence to the next level. So ways to get involved are to work for those professors, because they're often down in Washington, like many of us at the Friedman School are, and there's a lot of work we do behind the scenes to prepare for those meetings, whether it's delivering testimony, Capitol Hill, or whether it's working hard on creating national recommendations. And so from those disciplines, it might be quite different than the other responses, but there are incredible opportunities. And I think our graduate students, particularly our doctoral students, we often bring to meetings with us so they can really see how policy gets made with the science as a very big driver of it. So that's
great.
I spent a lot of time here at Tufts and then also working for the College Republicans in South Dakota after I graduated, recruiting folks to be politically active on college campuses. And one thing that I found that kind of cuts across disciplines is the common desire for free pizza and trips. And so free pizza explains itself. But Trips, like actually getting off campus and engaging people either in their community here in Massachusetts or, you know, like I said, I got on a bus almost every weekend in the fall of 2002 to go up to New Hampshire to volunteer on campaigns. I actually brought a bus of 50 people from DC in January of last year up to Foxborough to campaign for Scott Brown in his special election. It was the easiest bus I've ever filled with volunteers. And so folks really like kind of experiences that they're going to get. Like they can go hear lectures about their own subject matter if they wanted to go hear a lecture, but actually like going into the community and engaging with people on issues that they care about, that's something that I think is unique to the political world. So kind of capitalize on what this world has that is unique.
Just quickly, I mean, I think one thing that I think has been effective is figuring out, so if it's an engineer, figuring out some way that you can implement or suggest a policy to them that actually makes sense in what they're doing and what their interests are. And showing them sort of the tie with policy. I think that's very important. Carl was talking about how he was a biology major, and there was an issue that came up that made you want to get involved in politics. And I think for a lot of people, that's what has to happen. It has to be personal. And so an engineer is doing incredible work, and there's a lot of really good engineers that are working on Capitol Hill right now on issues like expanding spectrum for internet use and things of that nature.
When I said I was a biology major, you know, I can think of one distinct time when being a bio major was actually directly related to the work we did in the legislature, which was when we debated stem cell research, and I literally had to bring my bio textbook from Tufts to colleagues and have a conversation about, this is a cell, this is DNA, remember this from a long time ago. But the reason I say that is I think in society we always have a tendency to disconnect from what government is doing as the other thing over there that we don't want to get involved with, not realizing that what that government policy is over there is actually directly impacting what we care about right here. So thinking about first of all, I think you need to meet groups where they are. You know, if you think about different student groups on campus, you can't go and say, we want to bring you the policies that you're going to be really excited to work on. It's really engaging them to say, what are you interested in? What are you working on? And let's help think about how that connects to what's actually happening in government and policy that you might be interested in getting involved with, and we can help make connections for you that you would be interested in doing, as opposed to bringing them the solutions. That's one thing. The second thing is when you think about policy and advocacy in government, I think it's really easy to find information and get connected in the press about what's happening in DC. It's much harder to find out what's happening right here in the community or at the State House. But there are policies that are being debated literally every year on a whole slew of issues that impact people's daily lives. You know, thinking about public transportation, public health, education policy, science policy, broadband. You know, there are things going on in state and local government every day that I think as a student that you're looking for those connections, you can help people make those connections to what's actually going on right now that they can get involved with.
Yeah, I'm super psyched about this institute idea, and I think probably we all are. So anything I can do to help, and I'm sure this group can do to help, we would love to. I think it's a great idea. Mitch.
So those of you that know me know that whenever I stand up, it's always to talk about LGBT issues, and 7 years have passed and things haven't changed. So, but what I did want to talk about was that Dr. Economos and I, our relationship actually goes back to 2000. She's looking at me like, you have no idea what that is. But it's actually the emails I would always get for the Tufts Longitudinal Health Study, and I'm sorry I didn't do the last one like in 2004. So, but what I did want to talk about today was I'll call a question that I have about policy, and I think I'm asking for all of your advice. Every month, I have about 6 afternoons a week that I see patients in primary care clinic, and they're coming to me because they've had horrible experiences being LGBT with their doctors. And while I was in medical school, I started an organization that studies how physicians are educated to care for LGBT patients. We've done a study of 150 medical schools out of 174 and 10,000 med students across the country about what they're taught to care for those patients. we now have this data, we now have this evidence, which is great. And we're stuck with an organization, really one organization, the Liaison Committee for Medical Education, which is made up of the AMA and the AAMC, the Association for American Medical Colleges. They decide the curricula of all medical schools in the United States. So it's one NGO that we have to now pitch for policy. And so it's not the government, it's not a group or a coalition of people, it's really two organizations that, for all practical purposes, are one, that define standards and accredit all medical schools in the United States. And so the question, I think, is there any advice of really, you have one audience and only one that you can go to, that you need to try to convince that this is actually something important.
It's a fantastic real-life case study.
Oh. I mean, my reaction is to take the evidence you have and get it into the hands of many different stakeholders. So obviously physicians themselves who believe they need to be better educated to serve patients, but also the general public and many different levels within the general public. So taking those data and publishing them in brief form, in accessible articles for the general public. I don't know, the New York Times op-ed piece. I mean, there's many different ways, but I think you're going to have to reach a lot of different levels in order to convince this organization, because coming from, I would think, just a group of physicians who conducted a survey won't be as strong as coming from multiple levels. So think strategically about how you can disseminate the results, communicate them, and really create a group of advocates who will really be on your side, and the voice will be much louder.
Mm-hmm.
The other short answer I would give is money. And what I mean by that is when you think about poor patient outcomes and health outcome disparities for LGBT patients, it costs the entire system more money if we don't take care of people at the front end, and it costs the whole system more on the back end if we don't take care of them well in the beginning. So that's a motivator for everybody else. It's sort of the what's in it for me mentality. If people don't care about gay people, they're going to care when they see the costs rise for the whole system because gay patients weren't taken care of the way they needed to be and cost the whole system more money with poor health outcomes. So it's really sort of the self-interest model is one thing to think about. But in a more concrete way, there's also the Fenway Institute here in Boston. Are you familiar with them? So they're, I know, somehow involved with looking at medical schools and how they deal with curriculum issues for LGBT students. If you're not connected already, I definitely encourage you to think about them as a possible resource as well.
I think we have time for one more, or if anybody has any other feedback from Mitch, I'm sure he would be open to that as well. I think probably we are not the only people in the room that have ideas on the subject.
I would just say, Mitch, sorry, I'd say that what an amazing idea this is. And I take it back to some of the experience we've had with other advocacy issues that impact a small subset of people. Is sort of what Chris was saying, getting the stories, so humanizing the element, and getting the parents involved, so the stories of the parents and how this impacts the parents, and it becomes so that people can really begin to identify that with that. And I think, you know, you go back to some of the bullying issues that we see, or some of the issues that have been swept under the rug for a long time, that when you actually bring them out and people can feel like, you know, if that had happened to my child, how would I feel? And I think those stories become very real. So the storytelling is critically important.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Do we have time for one more, Nancy, or you want to move on? Yes. Yes, super quick question for me.
When I graduated from Tufts, I left for 1 year, but I've come back and been here for 25 more years since then. But my year was with Senator Leahy and working on the Hill in the U.S. Senate. And we didn't have email back then, but we had handwritten letters. And the handwritten letters, they were really powerful, and I was very interested to hear the beginning remarks about email. And I wonder, do you ever get any handwritten letters anymore, or never? It's all phone calls or email, one or the other.
If I get a dozen handwritten letters in a year.
Really?
I get
Do you,
hundreds
okay.
of emails a
Okay.
week,
So-
maybe a dozen
so
written
then,
letters a year.
I'm sorry, I'm going to follow up for both of all of you. So if you were to get a thoughtful handwritten letter, does that matter even maybe more? Well, no, handwritten. Or I'm just
But a
curious.
personal non-form letter that's typed.
I will say the rare handwritten letter that I get in my office, I handwrite a letter back as a way of saying, I read it, I saw it, I appreciate the time that you put into this, because it is a time-consuming thing for people to do. I think it's one of the most powerful things you can do. Most people don't have the time to show up for a meeting. It takes a little bit longer to handwrite it and put a stamp and mail it than it does to email it, but it shows me that you took the time to think about it, and I think it's very powerful when that happens.
I know the congressman used to get a ton of handwritten letters, which was interesting, and oftentimes they were from, we used to get a lot of letters from senior citizens, for example, where they would take the time to write a letter. The congressman, so what we would do, the system is, every letter is then put into a system where the congressman can read them quickly, then they're typed up. But he does respond to those. And so if there's any correspondence that's sent as a letter, he's going to see it at some point. And so I do think it has an effect. It all depends on what the letter is saying, though.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much for listening and participating. I really appreciate it.